Well, good morning to everybody. I'm sorry about that. I'm not sure if you're going to watch this in the morning or the afternoon on Thursday, but hi, my name is Dale Larson, and I'm a professor of practice and the director of community relations and engagement for the Watts College of Public Service and Community Solutions. I also have the honor of chairing the Arizona State Parks Board. Have done that for the last 3+ years, and I'm a board member for the White Tank Mountains Conservancy. So those are a little bit of my sort of practice relationships along with it. And I wanted just from the outset to mention a little bit of an historical factoid about our engagement and Casca, and where I think this may have sort of germinated. Several years ago, and I can't remember if it's 6 years ago or 10 years ago, but several years ago when Laddie Kaur was just inaugurating the Center for the Future of Arizona, and that wonderful asset about how Arizona's physical geography is its greatest asset and the like. Our dean, Jonathan Coppell, myself met with Stacy, Butte, Kim, Ken, and we were talking about this notion of a more strategic relationship to our public lands and parks. And in that conversation that took place at the Desert Botanical Gardens in the Webster Auditorium, I can remember as if it happened yesterday, came this notion of CFA introducing a competition. And certainly Casca then became one of the 5 pilot efforts in looking at the environment and conservation as an area. So I like to take some credit and some claim for being part of the germination that started this whole area, which is a good segue into my presentation about Arizona, public lands, and the park. So bear with me and we'll go through a set of stages. There is no one probably has contributed more to the public lands history in Arizona than President Teddy Roosevelt. He certainly was the iconic figure that visited here often. He was here obviously for part of what is now the Roosevelt Dam, but the beauty of Arizona was something that was just so enamored with him. And we study, and in our classes, we talk a lot about the legacy that Teddy Roosevelt left us. And if you look at that quote, that statement that he did back in 1903 at the Grand Canyon, that was really the beginning of a national focus on what Arizona has in terms of its open and public spaces. As you all know, the Center for the Future of Arizona and the Arizona We Want, back in its initial Gallup Arizona poll, stated that the state's natural beauty and open spaces are seen by our citizens as our greatest asset. And what a powerful, powerful paradigm, philosophy, statement, that when it all comes into the areas where we agree on or we disagree, this Gallup poll about our physical property is by clearly the most important asset that we have in our state. When you look at the public land facts of Arizona, we are blessed beyond comparison of what we actually have to enjoy. And if you look at these millions of acres of national forests, nearly 15 million acres, 17.5 million acres of subsurface public areas. Our tribal lands are nearly 20 million. And even though we don't think of tribal lands as public lands in a real technical way, they are part of the sovereignty of the Indian tribal nations. And it's an enormous tourist attraction for our people to be able to visit. We have over 4.5 million acres of wilderness areas, and we have 90 designated wilderness sites, which is the 4th largest in the United States, only in comparison to Alaska and states like California. We have over 9 million acres of state trust lands. My colleague on the State Parks Board, Land Commissioner Lisa Atkins, is the manager for all of those lands. And then in 2018, and I'll get an updated figure on this, over $330 million were generated from trust land sales. If you look at the combined area of tribal, federal, state, local lands, 60 million acres in our state. That represents 82% of all lands in Arizona are considered, in my working definition, public lands. And here's some more facts that most of you obviously know about because you've all visited these. We have 3 wonderful national parks with 19 national monuments, 7 national forests. We have, and I'm very proud to represent the fact that we have 32 state of Arizona parks. There is at least now $21 billion in tourism direct spending. Obviously, that's taken a hit in the past year plus because of the pandemic. But there's also then $2.9 billion in tourism related tax revenues. That's an incredible economic driver when it comes to the relationship of our public lands to our state's economy. Let's just go through a brief history of land dwellers and notable events in our state. If you go back to the ancient Hohokam, Pueblo, Anasazi, all of the ancient prehistoric Indians that took place well before any of us were in the modern day period. In the modern day, there are 20 now Arizona tribal nations. Navajo, obviously, as you know, is the largest. In 1862, it was the first of a series of homestead acts that was passed by Congress, which allowed for over 1.6 million acres of homestead properties that took place. Arizona was a huge participant in that area. In 1869, all of you learned this back in 4th grade when you were in Arizona school, John Wesley Powell was credited with the first Grand Canyon expedition. 1872, Yellowstone National Park was the first established national park. 1882, interestingly enough, was the first unsuccessful attempt to establish Grand Canyon as a national park, and I'll later talk when it was actually established. And then in 1905, and again a credit to Teddy Roosevelt, the U.S. Forest Service was first established. 1906, the famous Antiquities Act was deemed an executive order by President Roosevelt, which established the national monuments. He worked with John Murray, Interior Secretary, Garfield, U.S. Forest Service, Gifford Pinchot, created 18 national monuments, 51 bird preserves, 4 game preserves, millions and millions of acres of protected land. This is important because Teddy Roosevelt did this as a Republican, as an executive order. And that has opened the door for several presidents since to use the executive order privilege to increase the designation of national lands throughout the United States. And in this most recent administration, through executive order, to take some of that away from various states on it. So the executive order privilege is also an extremely controversial public policy tool that we hope our presidents, in this case, will be advocates for our national open lands and open spaces credit. 1908, Grand Canyon was established as a national monument. 1911, Teddy Roosevelt at the Old Main delivered the Arizona Territorial Speech at Tempe Normal School. Obviously, you know what happened in 1912. And then in 1916, the National Park Service was established. So here we go through a list, and I won't go over all of them, but these are notable events in our history between the Grand Canyon National Park established, which just a year and a half ago was its 100th anniversary. 1935, WPA, the Work Projects Administration, and the Civilian Conservation Corps were established. I'm a firm believer that from a federal government perspective, we need that kind of federal support again to get people working in our national monuments, national parks, Forest Service, et cetera. 1964, the Wilderness Act was established, which established all of those groups that we now are so familiar with. 76, the federal land policy finally took away homesteading. The Bureau of Land Management was established, a very controversial agency to this day, particularly here in the West. And then in the 1970s and 1980s, often spearheaded by then Governor and then President Ronald Reagan, the Sagebrush Rebellion, which we still have episodes of that Western rebellion about the federal lands being under the federal government. So here's just a list of the federal agencies in the Department of Interior that you all are familiar with, I would hope. National Park Service just had their 100th year anniversary, BLM, Reclamation, U.S. Fish and Wild Service, Indian Affairs, U.S. Geological Survey, Ocean Energy Management, and the Bureau of Safety and Environmental Enforcement. In Arizona, we have 24 units, we have 3 national parks, and we have 19 national monuments. I would give you a quiz to ask how many of you can identify the 19 national monuments, but since this isn't a classroom, I'll bypass that for the time being. Here are the federal reserves in Arizona. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with these. I'm sure a lot of you have visited them. If you haven't, certainly here at ASU, we are a repository for a lot of this information and can provide help. A lot of these areas oftentimes are covered by the Arizona Highways magazine. We see a lot of pictures and day trips that are taken that show off what the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has. BLM. BLM is a huge federal agency, as you all know, in our state. Over 12.2 million surface areas, 17.5 million subsurface acres, 47 wilderness areas, 4 national monuments, 2 national historic trails. BLM is a very misunderstood organization, and I'm not here to lecture one way or the other. The BLM obviously gets a lot of controversial press, particularly when there are episodes with ranchers and other public lands where the theme is that the federal government prohibits private landowners from being able to do things on properties that are near their ranches or on their ranches. But the BLM administers long-term leases and permit use for grazing, hunting, and mining in Arizona. And this notion of PILT, which is permits in lieu of taxes with Arizona counties, saves counties a lot of money, giving them the permits to be able to do the grazing, hunting, and mining. So I mention this only because there is a balancing act that goes on with the BLM and rural counties in terms of their use for their own purposes. Department of Agriculture, we all know about the National Forest Services. You're all very familiar with the forest services that we have in this state. Incredible natural asset that we have and is used hand in hand. My guess is most people who visit Arizona don't know where a national forest starts, where a national park, or where a state park, or where a county park. It's all beautiful Arizona land. These are the national monuments in Arizona. I would hope that take a screenshot of this and then you can put it on your bucket list to be able to visit all of the ones with the Bureau of Land Management, the National Park Service, on all of these. I obviously have several favorites of my own where I've taken my children and now my grandchildren to, but this is a perfect list of activities and facilities for you to all visit. So here we go again. This is a recap of the wilderness areas that I mentioned earlier, but I want to talk a little bit about, and I think this relates to the goals of the working groups that CASCA has. What are the threats that we have, and what are the threats that we've identified? Well, we know first and foremost that this balancing act between recreation, preservation, and conservation is an incredible challenge. So the overuse of our national public and open space lands is a threat. It's not that it needs to be completely managed because we don't have the capacity to completely manage that. But if nothing else, the pandemic has demonstrated that nature doesn't close and that our trails and our attractions, particularly here in Arizona, have been overused. I mean, we see people hiking now more than ever, new hikers that are not familiar with the rules and regulations of being a good nature hiker, the trash that has picked up, the vandalism that has taken place. You can talk to any of the park managers throughout our state. federal, county, or municipal, and they will all talk about, we love having people in our areas, but trying to keep up with the overuse has been a real threat for us. Technology is a threat in the fact that there are so many apps, there's the drones, all of the areas now that are used, which can be an asset, especially some of the apps when it comes to being able to hike and not get lost and not get abandoned, to the idea of the privacy and the security of drone technology going throughout our state. People that are using technology that may not be 100% accurate and find themselves lost. So technology can be conceived as a threat. We all know about fire suppression. I'm worried to death about what's going to happen this year with the modest winter that we've had and the modest amount of rains that we've had. Certainly these most recent winter storms have helped, particularly in the higher elevations. But my guess is that we are going to be in for another threat of fire danger coming up in this spring and summer. Pollution, both air pollution, water pollution. I mentioned lack of public awareness, and I think this is where our strategy with CASCA is so important, that the more that we can bring public outreach, education, training, orientation at the youngest age levels on up, the more that we're going to be able to protect our assets. And then, of course, climate change is very much a part of our everyday life. Here's some other of the national designations that I haven't mentioned. If you haven't been, by the way, to the Yuma Crossing National Heritage Area, I would highly recommend that you go there. It's an incredible tourist attraction and facility. The folks in Yuma are doing a great job, and we have a state park located right there. Department of Defense, we don't oftentimes think of the Army Corps as being one of our stakeholders, but they are. And just to give you this nightmarish maintenance and backlog just in the Land and Water Conservation Fund, and this is probably low end of $580 million. Now, the good news, and I have to update this slide presentation, the good news is last year during the Trump administration and Arizona's delegation were successful in passing the Great America Outdoors Act, which has now identified permanent funding for the LWCF. So that was a huge step in the right direction for it. Late in this most recent administration, some executive order steps were taken to shift some of these funds into areas where they were not originally designed. And now the current administration is trying to backstep and bring that monies back so that Arizona state parks can be the conduit by which federal funds can come in and benefit local communities. There's challenges about the match of local with the federal funds going through that our state parks agency is trying to deal with. But that is the Great American Outdoors Act was a huge step in our direction. And thank you to our Arizona delegation for supporting it, both Democrats and Republicans alike. I show this only because it was one of the more recent surveys back in 2019 by Colorado College. They have a research element that talks about the mindsets and the survey work of people and their appreciation for the outdoors. And if you look at this, and this is for Arizona, this is strictly for our state. They did it for all the Western states. 67% of Arizonans regard themselves as conservationists, 64% as recreation enthusiasts. Nearly 70% prefer that the new Congress play more emphasis on, and that took place with the passage of the Great American Outdoors Act. More than 65% believe that the impact of wildfires is a huge, huge threat to our environment. Only 20% of Arizonans want more domestic energy by maximizing the amount of national public lands available for that. In the outdoor recreation economy, 53% say the ability to live near these areas is why they live in the West, why we come to Arizona. And 84% believe that the economy, the recreation outdoor economy, is important for the future of their state and the Western United States. Look at protection of land, water, and wildlife. 80%, 82% believe that states have to use funds to protect and restore the health of rivers, lakes, and streams. 73% believe to conserve wildlife corridors. As I mentioned earlier, I'm a board member of the White Mountain Tanks Conservancy. Wildlife corridors is one of the most important policy priorities that the Conservancy is attempting to do with that incredible growth of population in our West Valley and the 7 or 8 municipalities that are in where the white tanks take place and where the estrellas are. And then finally, in terms of public input, only 17% thought it was a good decision to reduce the amount of time the public can comment on these areas. That was last administration. I'm very hopeful that'll change with this administration, especially with our new presumed appointee to the Interior Secretary. And 55% think it was a bad decision. Either way, and this was back in a year ago, we win. And certainly Arizona Public Lands Day is coming up in April in 2021. And this is Together for Wildlife Conservation. I'm going to end this, and I apologize for kind of droning on about this, but we're all here because of people in our past that have influenced our interest and our love affair with nature and conservation. And when I talk in class and I've talked to various groups, I have a kind of a hit list here of a lot of people that have influenced certainly my interest and devotion to the outdoors. And you can see most of these names are very recognizable to a lot of you, maybe some not as much. Aldo Leopold was who I studied when I was at the University of Wisconsin back in the late 1960s. Joseph John James Audubon. Rachel Carson is still to this day probably one of my most famous and influential authors when she talked about what happened in the 1960s. We mentioned about Roosevelt. Increase Lapham is a Wisconsin conservationist that I grew up with. Peter Wohlleben is a wonderful author on trees. If you haven't read about him, all of the names. Ed Abbey, probably today he would be considered an anarchist. We need more Ed Abbeys to be able to write about what's happening in our conservation. Certainly as a kid, Johnny Appleseed was important to me on that. Richard Louv, who was probably the most current nonfiction writer when it comes to children. My father was an incredible influence to me. When I showed this to my grandchildren, they criticized me for not adding one other name. And I would hope, and I will do this on the next time I do this slide, but certainly Dr. Seuss should be on this list with the incredible Lorax. I read that book to our grandkids time and time again. The movie came out, and if you haven't read the Lorax or seen the animated movie, the Lorax, please do, because that character gave voice to trees that did not have voices. So for what it's worth. As I said, Teddy Roosevelt is my all-time nature hero. We cherish him. The Roosevelt name is throughout Arizona. We need to make sure that his legacy is never forgotten. There's a picture of both of him and Moore back in the late 1800s, early 1900s when he was here looking at the Grand Canyon, and this happens to be at Yosemite. These were all the things that Teddy Roosevelt did, which I've already talked about, which are just incredible contributions to our country, to the West, and to Arizona. And these are some quotes I would like to leave you with. And the one that rings just to me is what Ed Abbey said. Why so many people want to read about the world out of doors when it's more interesting simply to go out for a walk into the heart of it. That's how easy and simple I think our philosophy is. Keep your quotes, keep your stories We need to be great storytellers. We need to be great advocates and ambassadors for Arizona and for our outdoors, and particularly for our public lands. So that's the end of my presentation. I'm happy to be a part of this. I'm glad to be a part of the original history of Casca, and I look forward to having you all contact us and what we can do here at ASU with the Watts College to be able to help you and support you in this incredible legacy building area. Please, let's never forget what Teddy Roosevelt did for us and what we can do for our future generations. Thank you all.